Good afternoon, everyone. For today's office hour, I am going to answer a question that was submitted to the form. And yeah, that's pretty much all that we're going to cover today. Let me share my dot pad and then just go through what was asked. So the question was about functions, which is in line with our topic for the week. So I'm just going to briefly answer the question. The person asked what's the difference between these two functions? This is the first function here, and then this is the second. So going by the syntax, you see that the clear difference between these two is how the arguments were being declared. This one here was declared using curly brackets, and then this one was declared using square brackets. So let's look at the difference, shall we? Let's create our first function, which is function with square brackets. And then we have a second function with curly brackets. This has arguments with square brackets. So let's just assign this, and then we also assign the same for this. So if you remember from our office hour yesterday, I mentioned that if you're using, okay, before we go into that, this square brackets, the curly brackets like we discussed yesterday shows that the arguments are optional, right? You can choose to pass in a value to the argument that is, you can choose to assign a value to the argument that is passed into the curly brackets. The square brackets, on the other hand, they're optional as well, but they are positional. So you know how if we were to assign assign this argument to our function, this, and then maybe we were to add extra. Sorry, I missed the comma. When we were to add extra, if we were to call this function, would have to assign values to each of these arguments just the way they're positioned in between the parentheses. But the difference with square brackets is no matter how many arguments I pass into this function, I can choose to assign values in any, I can choose to assign values randomly. I don't need to follow the way they were positioned in between the curly brackets. The way this function is, the way we declared this argument, if we were to add square brackets, the difference between what we had before and what we have now is that these arguments are now optional, but they're still positional as though we did not have the curly bracket, the square brackets in the first place. And we have this error here because we're expected to not have null values as we're expected to not have null variables. Hence, we get to fix this by either making this argument nullable or assigning a default value to our arguments, right? We talked about that yesterday. It's confusing. It would be great to just briefly watch the video from yesterday and catch up with what we're doing right now. So let's just print the values that we're going to get. Let's just copy that because we're going to need the same thing. Sorry, I forgot the expression. Okay. So we have these two different functions. Now, if I were to call the first one function with, let me just copy the name because that's pretty long. So let me call the second one just right after. We see that we do not have any what's it called? Even though we have assigned arguments to each of these functions, we can comfortably call the functions without assigning values to each of these arguments. It's a different case if we were to declare this function without the square brackets. Here, we're going to have the error that 2 positional arguments expected but 0 found. We haven't passed values to each of these parameters that we assign to a function. But with the square brackets, it can fly. We're not going to have that error because these are now optional based on the square brackets that were added to the arguments. But, okay, let me change this to int so that we get to see the clear difference. But if I were to assign 50 and Abbie here, we're going to have an error because we cannot assign a type of int to that of string, and we cannot assign that of string to int. So it's still expecting us to pass our values just the way they're positioned right here in the list of arguments. And to make this pass, we would have to assign them just the way they're positioned. I can choose to assign a value to just the name. And then I can also choose to assign a value to the age as well. And then when we run the function, we expect to see my name is Abbie and my age is 50. That's for the first function. But the second is null because we haven't assigned any value to it. And we get to fix that if we remember for these optional arguments, declared with curly brackets, because we're free to assign different, we don't have to assign values to them in a positional way. So we get to first of all call the name of the parameter, then we assign a value to it. The same thing with age in this case. We get to call the name of the parameter first and then assign a value to it after a colon. So if I were to run this code, I should see the value is just assigned in the console. And if I choose to not assign a value to age, I'm going to get a null value for age in this case. So I hope that was able to clear out the clear difference between these two positional arguments. These two optional arguments. This is optional, but this is still positioned, even though it is optional. So when you're assigning a value, you have to assign it just the way the arguments are being declared. But this one, we can choose to start out with age in this case, or start out with name, whichever way you want to assign your values, right? So that's the primary difference. And I hope that's cleared that. So if you do have any other questions on functions, please do well to leave the question using the form, and it would be covered in our next office hour. Thank you all for joining. I'll see you. I think our next office hour is on, I'm sorry, I always mix up the dates. Let me quickly check. Our next office hour is on Friday. So